Today's episode explores one of the most disturbing intelligence programs of the Cold War, MKUltra. For decades, the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, ran secret experiments attempting to understand and potentially control the human mind. These programs tested everything from psychological manipulations to drugs like LSD, often without consent of the people involved. While many people associate MKUltra with experiments in the United States, some of the most controversial cases actually happened in Canada, particularly at the Allan Memorial Institute in Montreal, under Dr. Ewen Cameron. His experiments included techniques known as depatterning and psychic driving. Today, we're going to unpack the Canadian connection to MKUltra, the real victims of these experiments, and how some of these techniques influence later psychological and military research. We'll also talk about related programs, from intelligence research into ESP, and how MKUltra tactics have been used at Guantanamo Bay, to remote viewing projects like Stargate, which also included well-known remote viewer Joe McMonagle. And finally, we'll look at the bigger question: how ideas about mind influence, psychological warfare, and emerging technologies might shape the future. Join us as we get rebelliously curious. Colin, thank you so much for joining me on Rebelliously Curious. For years and months, in most recent months, I've been doing so much MKUltra research in conjunction with another investigative piece that I'm working on. But I found myself in this MKUltra Canadian hole, not so much the American side, but the Canadian side, looking at all the lawsuits that have been happening since last year and then previously, all the court cases that have been going on with MKUltra Canadian victims and how they're looking for a form of reparations, but payment through a lawsuit. So I came across your work and the work that you've done in conjunction with MKUltra and also the Canadian victims as well. So before we get into what is MKUltra for people that don't know, I would like to say thank you for joining me on the podcast today.
Thanks for the invite.
Thank you. So yes, for people that don't know, what is MKUltra? What was the MKUltra program? Just to give someone who's listening to this and thought, you know what, I've heard about it, but I'm going to listen to this podcast today and get a better idea of what is MKUltra, and that it's not a conspiracy theory.
No, it's absolutely documented. So how I got into this personally, so born in Canada, grew up in Canada, medical school in Edmonton, psychiatry in Winnipeg, worked in Winnipeg for a while, then moved to Texas for much better job opportunities and better weather. And I've been in the US ever since. So I've probably been at the hospital I was working at like 3 months or something. And a woman with multiple personalities came up to me with this bunch of papers, and all paranoid and shaking. Here, take these. I don't want them anymore. I looked at them, and it was some MKUltra documents, so which had all been declassified in the 1970s. So that's what got me into this. So then I read a little bit there was to read about it, and then I went down to a correspondent of the CIA, and I was down in Northern Virginia for a conference, and I got a taxi and went to the reading room that they set up, and they wheeled in. It's 149 sub-projects in MKUltra. So there's 149 file folders. I went through them, made some notes, and then ordered them all, which was 15,000 pages. So that's how I got into this. So in the Second World War, the U.S. wanted to coordinate all their intelligence services, so they formed the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, and then it was disbanded at the end of the war in 1945. Then the CIA was created in 1947, and a lot of the OSS guys sort of moved over and formed the CIA. In April of 1950, the head of the CIA at that time signed Operation Bluebird, into action. And that's important because that's 3 months before the start of the Korean War. And the the disinformation cover story was, oh, we only got into this MKUltra stuff defensively in reaction to what the communist Chinese were doing, which is obviously not true because it started before the war started. And so there was 2 programs, 50 to 54-ish, called Bluebird and Artichoke. Then that was rolled over into MKUltra, which ran into the early 60s, which was rolled over into MK Search, which ran into the early 70s. And then in parallel, there's this is just what's been declassified, which is just the tip of the iceberg. Project Often, several other ones with different names. That's all, like, nobody can debate it. Nobody does debate it. It's totally documented, totally objectively real. And MKUltra is just the best known one of them all. And some people use the term MKUltra as sort of an umbrella term to cover all CIA mind control, but technically it's just one program. And it was divided roughly into thirds. So 1/3 was kind of chemical procurement contracts, industrial contracts, because they're using all kinds of drugs. Another third was the investigator was unwitting, which means he didn't know it was CIA money because it was sent through a front organization, which is called a cutout. And then a third, the investigators were cleared at top secret, so they were witting, and they did a whole variety of different things, hypnosis experiments, testing different kinds of drugs, on and on and on and on. Probably depends on your point of view, the most glamorous or the most outrageous project. There was 3 sub-projects. A guy who used to be a drug officer, George White, became the head of this Operation Midnight Climax, it was called, which was sort of an informal name for these 3 MKUltra sub-projects. And they set up safe houses a little bit in New York, mostly in San Francisco. And they hired prostitutes and had the prostitutes come into a special place they set up, all decked out like some sort of brothel from the 19th century. And they had a one-way mirror, so the CIA guys would sit behind the mirror, and the prostitutes would bring the guys in, who they picked up at bars or wherever, dose them with LSD without their knowing, and purely for professional purposes, the CIA guys would watch them have sex. And so it's just like crazy piled on crazy. And in the documents, it says the purpose was to study the effects of LSD in a setting that mimics an interrogation, where the person being interrogated doesn't know they've gotten LSD. But the most interesting thing about that was there's a memo from one CIA guy to another CIA guy saying that it's a lot of trouble managing these Jekyll Hyde personalities, referring to the prostitutes, not to the Johns.
Oh, wow.
So there's all these. I always say that the best cover story is a true story, right? So first cover story is it never happened. We don't do that here. Then all the documents came out, and then it's oh well, we were just studying the effects of LSD to see if it would be useful in an interrogation. But actually, underneath that, they were studying the Manchurian Candidate prostitute or alter personalities that they could use as honeypots, used to gather info on people. And so that may be, okay, that's going too far. That's just science fiction. That's not real. But there's a guy named G.H. Estabrooks who actually was, I think he was born in the Maritimes. I can't remember if it was Nova Scotia or Newfoundland. But his professional career was at Colgate College in upstate New York. And he's got a book called Hypnotism, 1943. And then he corresponded with J. Edgar Hoover for decades. I've got all that correspondence. And then in the early 1970s, he published a paper in a magazine about the super spy. And he corresponded with a lot of different people, high-ranking people in the mental health field. He spoke at conferences on military bases about the super spy. He invited J. Edgar Hoover's second in command to Colgate for conferences to talk about the super spy. And the super spy is basically the Manchurian candidate. So he describes, he doesn't describe in detail his techniques, but he would recruit some military guy who is susceptible, equals highly hypnotizable. Um, and then he would do whatever for a few months. He would create a new identity inside and a code word to access that identity. And so then the code phrase was "the moon is clear." So he'd bring that guy into his office. Hey, we're going to send you on this. Either he would do it or a military guy would do it on his behalf. I want you to go to Tokyo to deliver these documents. Okay, good. And then he goes, the moon is clear. He gives the Manchurian candidate personality the really classified message back to the regular guy, fly over to Tokyo. Then the colonel on the far end goes, oh, yeah, thanks for the documents. The moon is clear. Out comes and this is all in detail. You don't have to read between the lines. Delivers the message, response is put in back to the U.S. So he describes those kind of people being operational in the Second World War. And because I have the documents, he pitched creating Manchurian candidates to the CIA as part of Bluebird, Artichoke, MKUltra. And two of the MKUltra sub-projects, top secret clearance, were Martin Orne and Jolly West, two high-level psychiatrists from that time. And the projects were to study hypnosis, altered states of consciousness, and dissociated states. So that's just the documents. Imagine what's underneath the documents. So why is the Manchurian candidate called the Manchurian candidate? You'll be amazed to hear I have the answer.
I would love to know.
So it was a book in the 50s, The Manchurian Candidate, and then a movie with Frank Sinatra as the star. And then it was remade 10-ish years ago or 15 years ago. So I have another document from all these documents where one CIA officer is writing to another CIA officer saying he's concerned because he's heard that a group of American GIs, this is during the Korean War, have been captured while passing through a zone in Manchuria and subjected to hypnosis mind control. So the plot of the Manchurian Candidate is in CIA discussions documented before the book came out.
That's wild.
Which is
I'm not. Am I surprised? No. Maybe I look like I am, but I'm not too surprised. You know what I mean?
Well, and once you get into this universe, then it's endless. Are you kidding me? Like, so there's anybody who's taken psychology courses probably knows about client-centered psychotherapy. And there's a famous psychologist who's written a series of books, and he's like the humanitarian, nice guy psychologist, believes in human rights and all this kind of stuff. His name being Carl Rogers. So he's cleared a top secret to sit on the board of the Front Foundation that funnels the money to other people. And he himself is a contractor in one of the MKUltra sub-projects. So here's like Mr. Good Citizen, nice guy, touchy-feely. It's a top secret cleared CIA mind control contractor. So you just bump into all these wild facts as you go along.
We were talking just a little bit before this about, Morgan Stanley being being part of the CIA as well. It's just, there's so many of these people that have been part of these programs, or working in the CIA or adjacent to MKUltra that you would never guess would be doing these things. And, I think we've seen that in the case even in World War II and lots of other cases. You think Steve's the nicest guy in the world, but, he's doing some really heinous acts for his job or in the background.
One comment, the George White guy who was head of Operation Midnight Climax, he's quoted as saying, where else could a red-blooded American boy rape and murder with impunity?
100%. It's true. We
Yeah,
still see it
he's
today.
he bragged about it.
Look at the Epstein files,
Oh yeah,
right?
that's talk
We
about
still,
tip of the iceberg.
yeah, exactly. We still see it today. And it's interesting, even just when I say Epstein, he was really, really interested in eugenics and CRISPR. There's multiple
Right.
emails, him funding, universities and academic institutes in Israel. He really wanted to duplicate himself, right? But before we even get into something like that, I'd like to go back just to, MK Ultra and just all the adjacent programs because like you're saying, there were so many of them, right? And there were more heinous ones than MK Ultra. But
Right.
let's talk about the tactics and like the techniques because some of these tactics and techniques are still potentially still being used today, but we know for sure that they were used in Guantanamo Bay during the 9/11 pickup of all the different types of potential terrorists. And a lot of those torture techniques you can see were done to MKUltra victims, and they were using them in Guantanamo Bay. And it's horrendous. Like it's just
Also at Abu Ghraib.
oh my gosh, don't even get me started on him. I know the stuff that came out right now with in England where they are trying to say that, he's innocent. The American government has said he's innocent. Human rights activists have said he's innocent. And the man had a split personality disorder. If anyone wants to know, this is
Which
someone
man are you talking about now? Because
we're
Abu
talking
Ghraib is a prison.
he's a prisoner, yeah. But he had
Well,
a
it is the name of the prison.
oh, sorry, I was thinking of the prisoner
You
that
mean
is right
Omar
now in
Khadr,
Guantanamo Bay. Yeah.
the Canadian guy who was brought back to Canada?
No, he's a Palestinian that I
Palestine.
believe, yeah, he was a Palestinian, but I believe he was living in Saudi Arabia at one point. He grew up in Saudi Arabia. But he was the first victim that was picked up by the American government during the 9/11 terrorist, I guess we wouldn't call it raid, but pickup. And they put them all into Guantanamo Bay into Camp 7. And Camp 7 was the most heinous. And he was the first
It's the
person
one
to
that
get
doesn't officially exist, right?
well, right, that they said that it's closed down, and they tested on him first, all of these different techniques. They would put him in a coffin for 11 days. They would put
Mhm.
him in a little box chained, and they put water up to here so that he couldn't breathe. They waterboarded him. They would, like, embarrass him and strip him naked and interrogate him, and there was even more things they would do, not psychic driving. It might have been, I think it was depatterning techniques that they did that was from MKUltra, but was
Electric
really,
shock.
really, yep, yeah,
You
electric
can see
shock.
the photographs of the guy with the electrodes attached to him,
Yeah, and what is so
his
sad.
fingers, but also sometimes the genitals.
Right. And so what people are probably thinking right now, being like, Chrissy, he was a 9/11. He was doing all these horrible things. And no, he was an innocent victim. He had nothing to do with Osama bin Laden. He had nothing to do with any type of terrorism. What they found out later on is that he had split personality. So they ended up
We don't know that.
they tortured a man they tortured a man who had split personality disorder and was innocent, and the American government has said he's innocent. His lawyer is saying he's innocent. The human rights United Nations is saying he's innocent, and they're trying to get him out. But there's this one little clause in the CIA that if you're considered a war criminal, you're stuck there and nobody can get him out, and he's been there for 24 years.
Well,
It's just it and
one
even the
question.
UK government has given him money right now and has
Hmm.
said that, yeah, in most I think it was like 2 weeks ago, they did a case and they can't get him out, but they have declared him to be innocent as well.
So then it's endlessly the question, is this just mean people and incredible bureaucratic incompetence, or is something else going on? So,
Yeah.
which obviously I don't know the answer, but I suspect that all kinds of different locations, all these dark sites all around the world, of which we happen to know a couple, um, I'll bet you that they're creating Manchurian candidates and then releasing the guys to go back to the Middle East and be double agents.
That's an interesting perspective. Because I was wondering when it came into the type of depatterning and stuff that they were doing, if that's the case, because they have released a couple victims so far over the years that I've been following, and they have gone back to their homes and they've written books about the torture techniques that were done on them. But yeah, it's possible. And maybe we should go back to that. Let's talk about the MKUltra tactics and what they did. Like what was psychic driving and depatterning and all these kind of keywords that we hear as these types of strategies and tactics that they would do. But what were they and how did they affect people and how did it, create mind
One
control?
aspect of MKUltra and the other programs is just kind of throwing stuff at the wall to see what sticks. So they try this, they try that, they try this, try that. In 1975, at a Senate committee hearing, uh, counsel for the U.S. Army provided a list of 120 some different drugs that had been tested by the Army in mind control experiments. That's a lot of drugs,
It's
a
a
lot of people.
lot. Yeah.
So, and again, we're always talking tip of the iceberg. So in MKUltra, there's I can't remember the project sub number, but at Iona State Hospital in Michigan, which was a state mental hospital, one of the sub projects, there was 5 psychiatrists who all were previous military psychiatrists. And what they were doing is they had a whole bunch of incarcerated sex offenders who had been found guilty and sent over to the psych hospital. And they gave them marijuana, barbiturates, a whole variety of different drugs to see if they could get them to confess to something they'd never been charged with. Hypnosis, sensory deprivation, isolation, as we see in Abu Ghraib, attack dogs scaring the heck out of people, insulting the Quran, making a bunch of guys pile on each other sexually while naked with a female U.S. person watching. Just everything you could possibly, waterboarding, sitting in fixed positions for hours and hours and hours, sleep, food deprivation, on and on and on and on. And all these things are studied in various bits and pieces in MKUltra, including implanting brain electrodes. So remember, this is back in the 50s. So imagine how microchip satellite driven it all is now. But so this guy, who was top secret cleared neurosurgeon contractor, was putting electrodes in animals. And there's a guy at Jose Delgado's his name, and he was at Yale. And so I've got copies of the published papers in mainstream journals. So again, this is all 100% documented. So he puts an electrode in the alpha male monkey who's in a cage with a bunch of other monkeys, and he's been like running show and kicking everybody around. He's the boss guy. But there's a lever inside the cage, and when you press that lever, he's like just paralyzed basically. So the other monkeys figure this out and press the heck out of the lever. And then the follow-up photo is he's all huddled in the corner like this, and the other monkeys are doing whatever they want in the cage. Also putting brain electrodes in dolphins and using to deliver either a bomb or disarm something. They try and joke it off. So one of the claims is, oh, well, we put brain electrodes in a cat to see if we could get her, because they can navigate the animal around using remote transmitter. But the cat ran onto the street and got killed. We gave up on that. So there's all these stupid cover stories. But there's also humans. So there's photographs, again, in the medical journal of a girl 16 with brain electrodes implanted. And she's either sitting there just empty, staring off into space, looking normal, playing her guitar, or pounding the wall, depending on which button's being pushed on the remote transmitter to stimulate which electrode in her brain. Another not terribly amusing paper. So you have to remember that in 1972, which was the second edition of the DSM, which is the diagnostic manual, homosexuality was in and of itself a mental disorder. You were automatically mentally ill if you're gay. So, kindly psychiatrist at Tulane decided he's going to cure this guy of homosexuality, 19-year-old guy. The psychiatrist is Robert Heath, who was a contractor with multiple branches of the military and the CIA. brings him in, puts an electrode in his brain. So this is like, if you saw a fictional movie of this, you'd never dream that it's real, right?
Right. And let's clarify this for people. This is things that were happening in the CIA, but they were also happening during MKUltra too. So you're saying brain computer interfaces to really clear that up for people. These are brain implants that were happening because brain implants were started in the 1960s. And if people follow my work, they know I cover brain computer interfaces. So you're
Actually, the
saying that
50s.
1950s, thank you. You're saying that this was also BCIs were also attached to MKUltra as well.
Mhm. Yeah, it's
Wow.
one of the sub projects. Um, so this stupid story is they hooked this guy up with brain electrodes, and they could stimulate him to a pre-orgasmic state, and they gave him a little belt so he could stimulate himself. But he did it so much they had to take the belt away from him, and then they would expose him to heterosexual pornography while he's in a pre-orgasmic state to condition him into being straight. And then at the end, they brought in a female prostitute who had sex with him while they're monitoring his brainwaves. And then they debriefed him and the psychiatrist, the prostitute, who said, "Yeah, he functioned normally. Seemed like a regular straight guy." And
Wow.
then they bragged that he was discharged after successful treatment with only one relapse in the first 6 months.
Wow. It
And
wow.
they're completely like dead serious,
Oh, yeah. These
but
are real
straight faced about
accounts.
it.
Yeah.
And then what happened in the history of psychiatry is a gay lobby came up in the mid-ish 70s, and then in a series of steps, finally, it got kicked out of the manual altogether.
And there's so much that people don't know that are related. Like, you look at the LGBTQ movement, it's a counterculture movement.
Mhm.
And you see that people within that community, along with then in the Indigenous people and Indigenous communities, First Nations communities specifically in Canada, have been targeted as well, even through ESP testing or just even types of vaccine testing in residential schools. There's so many different groups of peoples and communities that have just been affected that no one ever talks about. Can you break down again, like what is depatterning and what is psychic driving, those two elements that were in MKUltra, so people have an idea of what they were doing within, attached to McGill University in Montreal with the Canadian government? Because and speak a little bit about, how McGill University was attached and, the Canadian psychologist and doctor that was very prevalent in doing
So
these tests to a lot of these
so
Canadian
the
citizens.
psychiatrist was Ewen Cameron,
Right.
who was actually born in Scotland, but his whole career was in Canada, professor at McGill, and, uh, he had, sort of a building that he ran, which did, quotes, "regular psychiatry." And, in my CIA doctor's book that's all about all these documents, there's a chapter on Linda McDonald, who was a patient. So she's, 63 maybe? In the 60s anyway. She goes to see her family doctor because she's depressed, which is not too hard to figure out because she had a whole bunch of kids who were very young and was overwhelmed, but not heavily, heavily depressed. And he says, "Oh, I'm gonna refer you into, McGill there, this Dr. Ewen Cameron guy." She goes in there in May. From May to September, she gets 103 ECT electric shocks, but each time, instead of pushing the button once, which is standard, and the American Psychiatric Association guidelines are 8 to 12 treatments, no more than that. She got the button pushed 6 times, times 103, and
Wild.
so that's what depatterning is, and so she's, incontinent, urine and feces. She doesn't know who she is, she doesn't know where she doesn't recognize her husband. She can't even quite grasp the concept of what a husband is, and then she improves a little and they send her home, and the instructions were, Just don't do anything, just normal life." And so I interviewed her in person. She had to have a map on the wall in the kitchen, and when her kids went somewhere to play, she'd write it down on the map, otherwise she'd forget right away. She was a skilled guitarist, singer, all gone. So she had complete amnesia from birth up to going to uh, McGill University. And then gradually, she just made this amazing recovery. Was coherent, normal, regular person, but no memory from early 60s back to birth. So that's what depatterning is. Psychic driving is kind of parallel, kind of tied in. So Ewen Cameron would give people barbiturates like every day for weeks and months. They'd be asleep, and he would have tapes playing. This is reel-to-reel tapes back in the day, playing over and over and over and over and over and over, making statements, making messages to the person to create a new personality.
Some of those messages too were like, I believe, like your mother hates you and stuff
Yeah,
like
yeah,
that.
really, really
They
nice
weren't even
messages.
like nice messages. They
Uh-uh.
were horrendous ones.
And the idea is we're going to erase the mentally ill person and replace it with a healthy person.
But some of these people weren't mentally ill. Like some of these women were going through, postpartum, let's say, and or for example, from what I've read is that a husband, if a woman wasn't agreeing, or, he felt that she was just being challenging or difficult, he would drop her off there and then, pick her up and she would pretty much be a Stepford wife at that point in time now, right? She was just
Exactly.
became like a machine. So some of these people didn't even have any mental health issues.
So this is the civilized country of Canada, right?
Exactly.
Not like horrible communist China. So I did 6 or 7 trips to Shanghai Mental Health Center, worked with people there and interviewed patients. And so it's the same story. I'm interviewing through a translator, a woman who's whatever, 45, 50. She's been in the mental hospital for 2 years. She's thinking she might get out next spring. So then, being a psychiatrist, I ask a few questions like, why are you in the hospital? The answer is, I wasn't being a good wife. Okay. What kind of symptoms were you having? I was having stomach aches. And then it turns out that the rules are that the doctors can't discharge the person unless the family says okay. Another woman was, she's more in her 30s. She thought, she was talking like, this is a funny prank I played on my husband. I went away for the weekend to visit my family members just on the outside of Shanghai. Then when I came, without his permission, when I came back to the mental hospital, been there for 9 months now. So it's the same thing. Just throwing people in the mental hospital, no independent representation, no lawyer, trampling their rights. So we think, well, that's China, communist China. Yeah, welcome to Montreal.
And what happened there? And we're still seeing court cases that were just happening last September, you know.
Right.
And I believe that there was some payouts earlier, but they didn't feel that it was enough for the torture that these people went through.
Yeah,
And so I agree with that. I agree.
there's
You know,
there's a fund for $100,000 per person. So Linda McDonald got 100,000.
that's it. That's it. For changing their life and torturing
But
them.
but it was tax free.
Right. But
That's how nice they are.
so sad. I'd like to get into I know you know a little bit about Stargate. I've been fortunate enough to spend some time with Joe McMonagle myself last year,
Mhm.
and he was one of the remote viewers and one of the best remote viewers within the CIA program. How do you feel Stargate would be connected to MKUltra or all the rest of those programs in remote viewing? Because remote viewing is really like some ESP, psi ability, and so how do you see that connected to MKUltra?
Well, one of the MKUltra sub-projects talks about investigating ESP paranormal abilities in the subjects. So it's direct documented crossover. Um, there's probably in the 90s, I guess. So Stargate began in the 80s, funded by 10 plus $1 million. Um, and this is just what is admitted to. And so they, again, got susceptible, skilled people who they recruited, such as Joe McGonigal, and they bring them into sort of like a lab area, a dim room, lie down, relax, and then they would assign them a remote viewing task, which is a plane went down in South America. They it's what's that called? Astral projection. So they go there, they narrow. Oh, there's the plane, and here's the coordinates it's at, and then team goes and finds it. Or another example is there's a Russian uh, submarine base, but we can't get any pictures of the inside. Could you go there? Oh, here's what it looks like. Here's what's in there. So in the 90s, sometime, I forget when, it was one of the main networks. There's an interview where the interviewer is talking to the liaison guy between the Army and the CIA, and the former head of the CIA is in the interview. And the Army guy's going, "Oh, yeah, we got like useful intelligence that was verified by other documented sources." And the former CIA guy is going, "No, no, no, we didn't find much. I don't think that's true." But
Oh,
it's
they
all
did.
admitted to. Yeah, yeah.
Oh, it is, yeah. And, they say that Stargate ended, but, we hear trails of this from Lou Elizondo, a counterintelligence agent that said that he was doing terrorist forms of attacks or visits in cells, allegedly using remote viewing. We can't confirm if that's true or not, but there are words and thoughts that these are potentially still happening and still going on.
So
Um,
my political spin on that is obviously all kinds of outrageous human rights violation stuff has been done, but sort of in defense of the military and intelligence community, obviously we have to have counterintelligence with all kinds of terrorists and bad players and so on. And it's unbelievable to me that adversaries are not running Manchurian candidates at us. So we need to be able to detect them, interrogate them, dismantle them, see what's going on. So from a defensive point of view, I think it's just part of their job to look into that kind of stuff. And they would be dereliction of duty not to. And that's the nice guy half of the equation. Then when we go over to the dark side, we have all these massive human rights violations and people dying and so on. So it's kind of like Star Wars, the force can be light or dark.
But I also
So,
think it's governments targeting their civilians
oh,
is the
yeah.
problem here, right? And they're also targeting other civilians in other countries too that are innocent as well. We have to be mindful of that. We're all from the
No,
human race. And so it's not that just they're targeting the bad guy. They're
no.
targeting innocent civilians and taking their lives or torturing them. And that's the issue with no reason or for research.
So MK Naomi was the project that was for outside the United States. So 97, 8, somewhere in there, Bill Clinton issued about this thick report on, on military experimentation, mind control stuff, but there's radioactive experimentation, fully documented, the name of the hospital, how much money was put into it, who the victim was, how much he was compensated for. So there's a guy in the Harvard system who comes into the emergency department in a coma. They don't know his name, so he's known as HP7, which is human product 7. So he was the seventh guy. They inject him with plutonium to study how it's distributed in the body and excreted, and he dies without waking up, which to me suggests he probably didn't give informed consent, right?
Hmm. So they killed him.
Yeah.
It's so horrendous.
So injecting plutonium into like healthy people.
Well, we see that. We hear of, stories now of children that are coming or people that were kids that were taken into these government programs. We hear adjacent to the GATE program or other programs that are outside of this where kids have been taken and they've been allegedly injected with drugs and asked to do ESP abilities and hold things, to be able to, use LSD. We're not sure if it was LSD or what that substance was, but we know that it was some type of substance that they were consuming. And we could probably assume that it was a drug because most of the time, we've seen LSD and all these other drugs have been used. So why would it stop now? Right.
Right.
But you see that there's been the targeting of children and innocent people. I want to go back to one thing you said though, and I'd like to talk a little bit about the ESP studies that was done in MKUltra. Can you speak outside of the things we just spoke about, but
Well,
why maybe it was potentially interested in ESP, and what were some of those experiments that were done in MKUltra that were bringing out ESP abilities besides remote viewing?
so all these files, they tend to be about this thick, but it went on for years. So this is just like tiny little few summary pages most of the time. And a lot of the documents are just like lists of checks that were written, just administrative stuff. So the real meat is hard to find. And in the MKUltra ESP stuff, there isn't really any meat. You just know that's the topic they were investigating. But
Interesting.
but obviously it's all for military intelligence use. And if, like, again, sort of in defense of the intelligence community, you take a normal guy off the street, turn him into a serial killer, which is called basic training, send him off to kill a whole bunch of people, and he comes back in a coffin or no legs or massive head injury. That's normal military, right? So compared to that, would I rather be hypnotized and come back as a Manchurian candidate? So it's kind of mild in a way. And you're going to bomb somebody like in Iran or wherever. That's a little harsher than psychic spying on them.
That's very
So in some
true.
ways, it's kind of like not as evil and not as bad and kind of mild and almost humanitarian in a way. But
I
but
think it's
but the flip side is
it's not that you signed up for it. Do they know they signed up for these
that's
things? Right,
no
there's no
consent,
consent. Yeah,
total invasion of privacy.
yeah.
All the psychiatrists and psychologists are massively violating ethics and
Can I ask you a question now when we're talking about psychiatry? Recently, I've seen within the DSM they have looked at neurodivergency, right? And we would classify neurodivergency as being like autism, ADHD,
right.
dyslexia. People know that I'm dyslexic and I was like a high functioning dyslexic, they say, but I was like, but what does
So
high
you're
functioning
funny.
really mean? So I can read and I can write, and I write obviously for the debrief. But yeah, I'm a high functioning dyslexic, but I think high functioning is just such a stupid word to use because it's all on a spectrum. But now we're
It's totally on
seeing
the spectrum, yeah.
Exactly, and we're seeing in
The low end of the spectrum is like people who can't form a sentence and can't do basic
correct,
toilet care.
right, they
So
can't read or write.
that's like serious brain problem.
Well,
But
it's
then
a
at the
learning disability. But let me say though, within the DSM, they started to classify in most recent years, looking at schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, lumped in to which are mental health disorders, lumped
right,
into now being neurodivergency. And so I was speaking with Julia Mossbridge, who's a really notable neuroscientist, and we spoke about this, and she has talked about how can be extremely problematic. And it will be in a recent article that I have of coming out right now. And she speaks to this and how these classifications have happened, and that it is problematic to lump all these people together because you're seeing neurodivergency isn't mental health disorders. So why are they doing a classification of all of these together? And then I'll ask you a question after that. But I'd like to know your opinion from a psychology perspective of why they would do that now in the DSM. It seems like it's going backwards, not forwards.
well, I've written in medical journals, psychiatric journals, a whole series of papers criticizing various aspects of the DSM. So I'm not like defend the DSM at all costs sort of thing. And there's lots of really dumb components to it, but it's like massively complicated problem, right? Because there's the mind and the brain, and how do they overlap, and how do we? So there's a big push in psychiatry to say that schizophrenia is a brain disorder, uh, but it's still a mental disorder, but it's a brain disorder, and they way exaggerate how genetic it is. So there's not just a clear box A is mental disorders and box B is brain disorders. They overlap and intersect tremendously. And like ADHD used to be called minimal brain dysfunction, but that's,
Really?
yeah, back in the like 50s, 60s. So somebody with schizophrenia, which itself is on a huge spectrum. So somebody can be psychotic because some huge life stress happened and they sort of go off the deep end for a few weeks and or a month or two, they come back together, and that's the only episode they have in their whole life. The other end of the spectrum is somebody who's like can't speak coherently, can't function, a permanent lifetime. So when you like if you work in psychiatry, especially in hospitals, you meet people where it really comes across as like not counting drugs and alcohol. There's something wrong with this person's brain. Like this person's brain is just not working right. So it seems like a brain disease, but it just seems like a brain disease. There's no solid science proof that it is schizophrenia I'm talking about. Um, so some things clearly are brain diseases. Some things that are kind of like in the middle, can't figure it out. And then some things are just like if you're in a car wreck and you get PTSD, that's not a brain disease. It's a psychological reaction to trauma. And all this stuff is all like tangled together in a ball. It's hard to sort out. So if
But
you're at the high,
neurodivergency, though, is how we process information. It's how we it's and compared to neurotypical, which I think is a stupid word too, because I think it's all in a spectrum. But if it's supposed to be neurodivergency, is how we process information is different than somebody who has a neurotypical way of processing it. And so with schizophrenia, be the same idea, same with bipolar, because then technically then it wouldn't be a disorder. It would just be a way of processing information. And I think that changes immensely how we view mental health, right? Because then does mental health does not exist then in that case if it is a neurodivergency. Because how do you say that someone is a paranoid schizophrenic that's on the other end of the spectrum, but then, you're like, well, they're just neurodivergent. It's like, well,
well, the
because then you
downside
would
to saying,
classify myself as being dyslexic as technically having a mental health disorder, but that's far from the truth. I'm
right.
so that it
But so
doesn't.
you can
Yeah.
make
How
a
how do
huge
how do you
error.
class how do they get away with that?
Well, they are well funded by big pharma and they've got political power and they just say we're the doctors and we know what's going on, basically. But you can make errors in all different directions. So you can be, this is just neurodivergence. You're on a power trip to make it be a mental disorder. Hmm. But then what kind of neurodivergence? If it's all in like you, the high functioning range, okay, it's just a difference, sort of like personality style. But there are people like you meet them in psychiatry who are like profoundly impaired, can't function. So you don't want to call them neurodivergent. So they call them mentally ill, which is kind of a more humane way to talk about it. But then if neurodivergent person becomes, slides all the way down the spectrum, at some point they're going to become unable to function independently in society. So calling that neurodivergence is sort of insulting to normal neurodivergence.
It is. It is.
So
And
it's
I
tricky
shouldn't
and
say I'm not
complicated.
as and also it does feel that way, but then I also do think about people that are, have mental health disorders and are suffering through these and they don't want to be considered other as well. So in people are having, you know, Julia Mossbridge here speaks about people that are having autism or have bipolar disorder or they have schizophrenia, mainly
Mhm.
schizophrenia and bipolar, that they're having these like telepathy moments outside of people that have autism that are speaking of this, but people that are schizophrenic or saying that they're having these precognitions and they're having these things and they're actually becoming true, and they're being targeted now as individuals, and either for research or
by
for victim
military
programs
intelligence.
that we're hearing. Yeah. So it's interesting now that this classification has changed. I just find it to be very timely, if anything, because neurodivergence is is a massive movement in the 90s, and now it is becoming an even bigger movement in the most current days. I want to just quickly move away from neurodivergency and talk about, I know that you've said in other podcasts that I've had listened to and have heard that there are other victim cases that you've heard about children or people coming forward to you when they were children that have had these types of government targeting programs that have affected them. And can you speak a little bit more about what you know when it comes to that?
So in my book, I just stayed 100% documents because I didn't
That's
want
great.
people attacking the documented facts and discrediting them. It's just rumors. Some mentally ill person said. But I've had many encounters with people who describe uh, satanic ritual abuse where the family belongs to this multi-generational satanic cult and human sacrifices and the whole works. Absolutely undocumented and unproven. But there's kind of what I've been told, there's several routes into being CIA military mind control victim. One is you're pre-programmed to be highly dissociative because of all that insane group trauma. So then the foundation for being a Manchurian candidate is already in place, and mind control doctors only just have to tinker with it and reinforce it a bit. Another way that you get recruited in, and the logistics of getting recruited in, are the military is involved in the, doesn't have to be satanic, whatever small spin-off Christian church or some new age guru who's on a farm with a bunch of followers. Um, but the military is kind of has somebody in there. They're they're part of the operation. So like when Waco burned down, the FBI confirmed that there was a guy named Robert who was FBI plant who was living in the compound who got out before the raid and the fire. So there's definitely divisions of intelligence agencies that monitor this, penetrate these people, see what's going on, all justified by counterterrorism. So back to the roots in, they already or have their hands on the person, so to speak, at birth, or they've got dirt on the dad because he's been a sex offender himself or something. So they just lean on him to provide the kid, or the kid's just sort of semi-regular family and they're enrolled in a gifted program, special after school program. And then from there, they start going to additional programming on the military base. So they're kind of like, without the parents really knowing what's going on, recruited in that way.
Yeah, that makes sense, and we're hearing that a lot now. Jordan Jozak is a person that in 2010, he said that he was, I believe, between the ages of 7 and 10 years old, and he was taken into a program as well under like the gifted program, and he was, asked to do ESP testing and psi abilities. So we're seeing and we hear about these children that are being targeted, unfortunately, with government programs. Do you think that there's any MKUltra programs now that are still happening today that are stems of older programs and now they just have different names? Do you still think it's happening today? Because in my perspective, if it's, we see a lot of eugenics and things happening in the 1930s and 40s, and it hasn't really stopped. And
Right.
I really don't think that it would. And why would it if it's been going for that long? But I would love to know your perspective if you think that it's still happening to some
Well, number
degree.
one, it's not plausible that it stopped. Why would they stop? It's like
Exactly.
we stopped using computers. It's not going to happen, right? Or we stopped weapons development, or we stopped building better planes, or we stopped all that mind control stuff. It's just not believable. And as I was saying earlier, from a defense counterterrorism perspective, you got to have expertise in this area to defend against it. So you wouldn't even be doing your job from a defensive side of things. And then if you look at the photographs from Abu Ghraib, Guantanamo Bay, I mean, it's right there. And Seymour Hersh, the guy who does all kinds of reporting, who has a documentary about him on Netflix, I think it is. He actually, like, I don't remember the names, but he gave the code name, the cryptonym of the projects at Abu Ghraib. So they were actually, it's not some, couple of people off the reservation. Those are administratively code-named, documented, top-down run programs. Well, that's all mind control.
Yeah, it's
And
true.
so,
And that's where I have said, I'm like, we see the tail end of this in Guantanamo Bay. They can do whatever they want. We could potentially maybe see this in prison systems that are private prison systems.
mm,
But Guantanamo Bay is that place. And so maybe they're not individually targeting civilians now, but they're using it within different camps, where they're able to get away with um,
well,
this type of
civilians are
horrors
targeting.
without being prosecuted.
Uh, so radiation has been released. I think the code name was Operation Green Run, if I remember right. It's in my book. Um, where radiation was released over civilian populations to study wind dispersal. There's a oddball bacteria called Serratia marisons, which clinicians never see. It's like very rare. The project was to release it into the subways in New York City to see how it spread, how many people got infected, because they're studying biological warfare. And there's a paper published in that era of a doctor in San Francisco reporting 32 cases of Serratia marisons infection, which never, ever, 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 ever happened. So they put plutonium in cereal of mentally retarded kids in school in Connecticut. All kinds of crazy stuff.
Oh, civilian. So what do you think? And those were a little bit, they're not just most recent, were they? And what do you
No, this
think
is
it would,
all.
right?
Uh,
What do you think it would look like today in your perspective, outside of Guantanamo Bay and in, internment camps and things to that degree? How would civilians be targeted to this day? And let's just say outside of, there is a group, I should side note, called targeted individuals. That is a
it's just, you
subculture,
beat me to it.
right? Oh, right.
The targeted
Right,
individuals,
yeah. But
because I get
here's the
contacted by
thing.
the.
Right, but targeted individuals, there's some people that are dealing with mental health, and there probably are some people that are. So, how do you weed through that? And then what are you seeing
Well,
today potentially as civilians being targeted by the
so I've
government and
had
what it looks like?
a bunch of emails from targeted individuals, and they generally, some of them are just, it's all scrambled up. They're obviously not in their right mind, but other people are perfectly coherent. Their story is perfectly plausible. They were working in such and such a facility, uh, and then all of a sudden, their boyfriend, who was in the military, got mad at them, and next thing you know, they're being targeted. And they're not saying anything unbelievable and fantastic, because the targeting is electromagnetic and sound weapons. So these electromagnetic weapons, you can Google them. They're easy to find, and like takes 5 to 10 minutes online. And you can see photographs of the weapons mounted on our vehicle. It's been used in the Middle East. It's been used here and there. Um, and there's one paper I have where it's Sandia Labs in New Mexico is the contractor, and it describes the weapons in an airplane, and it's been beamed at somebody on the ground from fairly low altitude. It describes the specs of the weapon, and it describes, depending on how much you crank up the intensity, you either get sort of a tingling, funny sensation, you get disoriented, you feel nauseous, you're knocked out, you're killed. Because it's basically sort of a very mild laser, right? So these weapons absolutely exist.
The Sandia Labs has been brought up many different times, even in conjunction with children being targeted in these types of
Mhm.
government programs as well too.
Right.
Why Sandia Labs? Like, have you, what else have you been hearing in the past that has always been associated with this laboratory?
Well, they're located in New Mexico, right?
That's correct. Yeah. A lot, everything's
And
happening in New Mexico.
yeah, well, it's the same place as the Manhattan Project.
Exactly.
So
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
this is like classified to the max, secret, security. You can't just walk in there and say, "What are you guys doing?" So it's a
Exactly.
sensible location, and it's probably just one of many locations, just the one that has leaked out into the public a little bit. I mean, if you're gonna go somewhere to do that kind of stuff, hmm, why don't you go to Sandia Labs?
Good point. Well, why don't you go to New Mexico? Right. That should be the new slogan.
You can go for a hike, but same trip.
Right. Be like, you want to get brainwashed? Go to New Mexico.
Mm,
No, that's the place to be. That's the new slogan for New Mexico. I found myself a couple years ago in New Mexico consistently month after month for work, and I was like, "Gosh, I probably should just buy a place here."
yeah, no kidding.
So much there's so much work to do in New Mexico to uncover, uh, and a wonderful region as well too. It's beautiful in certain parts for sure. My last question to you I find very interesting, and I see this through line when it comes to MKUltra and just other related government programs, is brain computer interfaces.
Right.
It's funny because I do write about it, and I really, when I first started writing about BCIs, in all truth of the story, and if people might know this if they listen to the podcast, but what happened was when I was a little girl, I was watching the Discovery Channel with my dad and the rest of my family, and there was like new inventions that are going to come out, and I must have been like 9 or 10, like
Mm,
I was young, and it was like new inventions. It was like flat screen TVs, GPS, and brain computer interfaces. And my
mm.
dad looked at me and he was like, "Chrissy, never put a chip in your brain." And that stuck
I
with
agree with
me.
that.
It's good
Yes.
advice, but it
So you
stuck with me for so long. And that's why I started following BCI when Synchron, was really picking up speed and Neuralink. I decided to cover it as a journalistic beat because I found it to be
right.
fascinating. But where do you
It's
see this
fascinating, but welcome
scary?
to, the brave new world, right?
Well, that's what I would like to ask you because we see this evolution. My thought that BCI is a way that you have mind control from MKUltra. BCI is the last step. BCI is, people say, already adapt to it. People agree to be part of it. And so you don't have to mind control them and you don't have to, target them as civilians. They'll decide to opt into it. And so I feel that that is the last step. And we've seen that with multiple things like social media, the internet, cell phones, you name it. People just adopt these things. And so when we look at BCI, the worst possible thing outside of all the amazing things that it's doing right now within the healthcare space, because we do have to say that. And I've spoken to some of those individuals that have BCIs and I've seen how it's changed their lives. And there are a lot of great people in healthcare wanting to help people that have different forms of disabilities, that this will change their life and give them meaning back into their life and to contribute back into society. But then we have this other pendulum swinging the other way that is really scary when it comes into the ethical aspects of BCI and where this could go. And to be honest, mind control is right beside it. And we're already seeing that now from what you were mentioning that this was already BCI, brain computer interfaces was already being tested in MK Ultra. So,
Right.
you know,
I agree with totally with what you're saying. So let's just go on YouTube and search for Jose Delgado bull experiment.
yes. Yes, I
There's a
have.
video on there.
Yeah. Yes, and
It
how it can control emotions. Yeah.
well,
The
it's just
BCI
what I
can
was
control
talking about
emotions.
before. So there's
Yeah.
a brain implant in the bull. It's charging around and trying to get the matador's cape, and then he pushes a button, and it's just like, not doing that anymore. The bull just stops.
America for sure is interested in that. And we've seen a lot of experiments related to the bull in the 1960s. And then we also see a lot of the healthcare stuff. But we also know, and this is not to rag on China because North America probably is doing it too. But what I know, speaking to a lot of different different neuroscientists that are working in Europe that have been closely connected to China more than the States, is that China is really interested in this from emotional perspective and how to control emotions for longevity to live longer. And that also can go the other way to control how you feel. And that's exactly what you're speaking about in that bull science experiment. It was to control how the bull felt. And if it was angry or it was sad. And so
Exactly.
you don't have to control someone's mind, but you can control them by controlling their emotions.
Which are part of the mind.
Good point. Good point.
So,
Yeah,
it's just like, there's a documentary movie made a few decades ago. It was, some guy who came from the future, and I think he was called the Terminator.
I think so. I think Arnold's something like
Arnold something.
that. Yeah, I think he
But
was
we're on the
Austrian and
edge of
played in it.
Skynet's already here.
Good
I
point.
mean, we're in that world. Not all the way in, but we're part of the way in already.
In your perspective, how do we stop something like this from, how do we first legislation is a big thing, and we see Mind Act, and Chuck Schumer has put that in on September 28th of last year. That has been put forward in front of Congress. But how do individuals, how do we protect ourselves from things like this, and how to be aware? And then also, how do we contribute to BCI or any of these types of things, not having the military industrial complex change society? What is your
Hold
tactics and
on, you're
strategy?
asking me?
Well, yeah, I'm curious. What's your tactics or strategy? Mine, I'll tell you mine. Mine is I won't opt in for a BCI. And it's funny because I've had, the conversations with many people. Would you and wouldn't you and why not? But I feel that, we have a lot of power as individuals to be able to push things into legislation and to make conversations and also to agree not to buy the products. We can agree to leave states or countries that mandate us to do it, but and we have the option to learn more, and we have the option to say no. But it's,
So far.
we talked about
So
public
there,
relations is a very tricky thing. And same with advertising. And the more they make BCI or anything else look glamorous, the more people are going to want it, especially
there's
when
a
it can give them amazing abilities that they would never be able to have in their own
right.
human body and mind.
So, which is Elon Musk is like amazing, incredible guy, is doing incredible stuff, but he's pushing this hard.
Very hard.
So there's a book called Toward a Psycho-Civilized Society, uh, which still in print. I think it was the 70s it was originally published, and it's Jose Delgado. His recommendation for the human race is implant an electrode in everybody's brains so you can control the population, and then we'll be psycho-civilized. But of course, the top generals and the top politicians won't have electrodes in their brains.
Well,
I mean, and that's published by a mainstream New York publisher, and he's completely serious.
well, yeah, and I would say I would imagine that some of those politicians would. If you look at um, how things happen, you have your intelligentsia, which is your smaller core. Well, when we look at propaganda, I should say, you have your intelligentsia, that's your very, very small group, and your insiders, and that in single core does not change. And it's a very small, tight group. And then everyone else around you is a follower. And a lot of politicians are followers. They're actually not in that small core
Right.
group. So that small core group would probably be billionaires and tech developers, and maybe some people related into presidencies or people in the CIA and people that are we don't even know of or know their
Well,
name because they're
that's what
working
I
behind
think
the
is
scenes. Yeah,
if you've heard of them, they're not the ultimate controllers.
I agree. Yeah, and they don't want to be known. And who would want to be known when you're doing the most heinous crimes, right? Colin, thank you so much. I could talk to you for hours about this. I just
Well,
well, we
got a
could.
solution to that problem. Yeah,
Well, I would love to have you back on the podcast one more time.
fantastic.
Yes, I'm like,
Wait,
thank
wait
you
a
so
minute, wait a
much.
minute, wait a minute now.
What's that?
One more time?
Well, no, we can multiple times. I will
Okay,
do,
okay,
at least every 6 months.
okay. I'm on board.
I would appreciate that. This topic, I think, is going to have multiple legs, and I think the work that you've been doing is helped so much
so much, I think, more than you would imagine, because it really is the start, I think, of something that's going to be bigger and bigger conversations that are going to happen down the road. And your work is going to come back up into those conversations in Canada, and I would say around the United States as well. So thank you for doing that. Thank you for taking the time to research it. Thank you for taking the time to care about victims and people that have been targeted by government programs and civilians that have been targeted and innocent civilians that have been targeted, because there's lots of them out there, and we need psychologists and other people to speak for them too when they can't speak for themselves.
I completely agree. Actually, I've met more people who've been targeted by their spouses viciously for years and years and years. So there's a whole nother sort of civilian, informal, inside the family, amateur mind control that goes on a lot.
Oh gosh, yeah, we call that gaslighting.
Yeah, lots of gaslighting, yeah.
Lots of gaslighting. Yeah, call that gaslighting and manipulation.
Mhm.
That's why I'm not married. But
No,
uh,
no wonder you're sane.
yeah, well, try to be. Some people might not agree when they're like, well, you'd laugh because they'd be like, Chrissy talks about the craziest things from UFOs, brain computer interfaces, MKUltra. But I think the most sane people do, in my perspective. Colin, thank you for being rebelliously curious with me today, and I can't wait to have you back on the show.
Good deal. Bye.